Cincinnati.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming, and thank you to everybody joining this World Economic Forum on Mind Matters all around the world on the WEF's live stream, which just began. I'm David Rhodes. I'm Executive Chairman of the Sky News Group based in London and a former young global leader of the Forum and now on the Forum's International Media Council, and I'll be moderating today's session. And we've got an incredible group to weigh in on the topic today, which is mental health at work. So first, we have Minister Motsoaledi of South Africa. We have Christy Hoffman of the Union based now here in Switzerland. Steve MacMillan of Hologic, and Bill Reedy of Pinterest. We've talked a lot at the Forum all week about productivity. And most of us that have been in these discussions, that productivity dialogue has been about artificial intelligence in its various aspects. But of course, another aspect of productivity, impacted by AI, but by many other factors that we're going to get into today, is mental health at work. And that's Mind Matters. That's today's topic. The Forum estimates that some 1 trillion in productivity loss is attributable each year to a mental health issue of some nature at work. So when you think about that, 1 trillion, the billions of hours of lost productivity to this situation, it really does merit the kind of discussion that we're going to have today. But we'll just jump into that in all of its aspects. And Minister Motsoaledi, I want to start with you. You look at this in a public health context, and there are so many factors that impact on mental health at work. Just describe for us a bit, thinking about that public health context, what are all of those factors?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I know that the topic is about mental health at work and productivity. But I wish to take it as a whole, because I want to argue that mental health at work is just a subset of the whole mental health problems. And unfortunately, I think we are in trouble, big trouble. Mental health is a Cinderella of healthcare systems. When healthcare systems get underfunded, the first to be discarded is mental health. We don't start with it. In other words, we'll deal with it if there is money. And having been in healthcare for that long, I know for sure this to be a problem. The World Health Organization even called a special conference, I think it's 10 years ago, about mental health. We took resolutions. We even developed a program. I don't know in other countries, but in my country, I don't think we have even implemented it. This despite the fact that the problem was recognized long time ago. Let me take you back to 1978. By the way, in 1978, I was a first-year medical student when the World Health Organization and UNICEF co-hosted a conference on primary health care in the small town of Alma-Ata in the former Soviet Union, where they defined what health is. And
so clearly, can I just ask, so you were a student at that time? You were watching that from afar, obviously.
Yes, and I was very inspired because I believed what they were saying, which never happened. Because they defined health as not just the absence of disease or infirmity, but the state of good physical, mental, and social well-being. And at the moment, in many parts of the world, we regard health as just good health as a state of physical well-being, full stop. The mental and social part we've discarded. That's what I'm saying. When I said I used to believe, but it's not happening that way. So that is the problem we're faced with. And it's getting worse because of the stresses of life. Now, post-COVID, is even
much worse.
It's much worse post-COVID. I don't know in other countries. In my country, there's a new issue now of drugs. There's a drug called crystal meth, which kids have gone to. It doesn't make them high. It makes them go psychotic. Yes.
Psychotic.
Yes, they go psychotic. They come, in chains and all that.
So you're covering a few different things here. I think when you think about it in a public health context, you're thinking about mental health, first just acknowledging that that's a part of public health, which is relatively new.
It is.
Second, that there's a whole context around what's going on in the community. If there are drugs, what are those drugs? What are new? What are old? Then there's obviously being able to fund these health systems. I want to bring in Steve for a moment, because one thing that you're talking about is that you say, right, the first thing to go are mental health programs, and you oversee a very large public health scenario. Steve, I think people think of Hologic, I know maybe I do, as maybe medical device people, maybe people who help people get a mammogram, maybe people who are in that part that the minister is describing of providing physical resources for health. But you've been doing some work, or maybe commissioned some studies, certainly a Gallup survey recently, that tries to get at what the outlines are of this part of the problem that's not in the physical.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And I probably had my eyes open much later in life than Minister Motsoaledi did. But about 5 years ago, we partnered with Gallup. For those of you who don't know, we are very focused in all women's health, breast cancer screening, cervical cancer. Just about every woman's probably had been touched by our products in life. But after years of discussions around women's health, what I realize is we're a diagnostic company, and what gets measured gets results. And there's always been talk. And so we embarked on something that I actually hope will become our most profound product ever, and it's one we'll never make any money on. And it's called the Hologic Global Women's Health Index. Now, we didn't know how to do this, so we went out and partnered with Gallup, who every year does the World Poll. And so what we've been doing now for the last 4 years, we just unveiled the year 4 report at Gold's House yesterday, is getting longitudinal data on 142 countries. We're interviewing almost 300,000 people every year. We now have data for 4+ years on 142 countries. And when they first came back to me with the questionnaire, and this was by partnering with somebody good, we were looking at cancer screenings, high blood pressure screenings, all these kind of stuff. And Gallup came back and said, we need to have a major component on mental health. And we even have questions in this index like, I feel safe walking down the street at night. Now, to your point, I had never thought really about mental health in that way. And it opened my eyes, but what we are absolutely seeing in the data is some emotions like anger and stress that you mentioned peaked during COVID, and they're still elevated but coming down. But the two emotions that are really rising and far worse today than in pre-COVID time is sadness and worry. And when you think about particularly
anxieties, worries.
Yes, yeah. And you think about it, I was raised by a single mom. And so I probably have a uniquely male perspective on everything that falls on women. And I think in a post-COVID world, right, it's always trying to balance everything, but there's still so much that falls on women. And I think the concerns about the healthcare systems, concerns about rights, concerns about everything have been magnified. And so while the immediate pieces of stress and anger might be down a touch, that sadness and worry rising is, to me, very concerning, very sad in and of itself. But also now we have very clear quantitative data to show that happening. And we're hoping as we take that to each country, they can start to put action plans.
So these are things happening, what you're describing and what the minister is describing in terms of drug use. These are things happening outside the workplace that certainly impact how people deal with this at work and in other contexts. Christy, you're very focused on work. You're talking about labor organization and how employees work, but some of it is work is changing. I mean, you've talked a lot about jobs that maybe didn't exist, if not pre-COVID, certainly in the time we're describing back to the 70s and 80s. What is it about work that is making this more of an issue?
Well, I think the single biggest factor in work sort of started pre-COVID and really became accelerated during and after COVID is the level of surveillance and pressure for higher intensity work that is made possible through the algorithmic management tools that we have now. So it links back to technology. And that, in general, the pace of work has gone up in so many places, but even if it hasn't, people are surveilled or monitored far more than they ever were before. And again, this accelerated during COVID. It causes huge amounts of stress to many workers. That's the #1 complaint in so many workplaces, is the level of monitoring and stress that they experience from that technology. I think another type of employee that's really become prominent in our work around mental health are the workers that work in the data supply chain, who do all the content moderation, or that could be an element of fact checking, but it's mostly like visuals and labeling and so on. In that case, that work can be really, really traumatic. Those workers, most of whom, not all, are located in the global south, could be looking at hundreds and hundreds of videos, all day long, 5 days a week, which show various degrees of really harmful, violent, and emotionally impactful content. Whether it could be like drowning puppies, which might be the softer choice, although all kinds of animal abuse, or torture, beheadings, violent acts, and they have to label that or, put it into a box or a category. That's a place where we're seeing, and we work with a lot of workers in 9 countries, and it does get media attention. I will say it's getting a lot of attention, and we're dealing with employers, and what is the answer in that scenario to that type of work? Because it does cause all kinds of PTSD, people saying their lives are changed forever. Even when they go home, they can't really relate, they can't sleep, they can't relate to their family. It's too traumatic. So we're looking at what can the solutions be in that scenario. It's not just enough to say, if you need psychological help, we have someone available. You really have to change the way. And part of that is rotating workers in and out of egregious content so that nobody's doing 1 or more than an hour a day, for example, of like the really egregious visuals, or reducing the pace of work, slowing it down. That's a big factor for those workers as well. Mandatory training, because some people won't come forward and say, I want mental health support, or they won't be given the time off their job to get that mental health support. They have to come on their own time. So, but really making some of that mandatory. And so we're looking at a lot of different possible solutions, most of which are not medical, or, it's really about how do we change the work so that it is less traumatic and reduce the impacts.
I want to get to Bill on a couple of topics, but we should talk about, you mentioned the Global South being a place where many of these, for instance, content moderation jobs, or jobs that didn't used to exist that could have these kinds of implications, now exist. Now, South Africa has often, on various issues, spoken a bit for the Global South in terms of representing what the situation is. So take us inside the communities that you represent, and how is work changing? How is work changing? How is work different, for instance, from when you were studying medicine? Very different.
Yeah, look, where I started on the general situation and say mental health at work is a subset, it will be unlikely if in that country mental health is not a big issue in the healthcare system. It will be unlikely that you will find it better at work, because it starts with the overall healthcare system. I know in my country it's compulsory to have a health and wellness unit, people who are trained in health awareness in every government department, at least. We're encouraging it even outside government in the private sector. But when you look into what they are doing, it will be mostly physical well-being.
Right.
Because the overall issue of mental well-being, they don't even think about it, you know. That's exactly what I was saying. Because then even the number of trained mental health care workers will increase accordingly if the budget allows it. But what I was saying is...
Well, and if Steve's figures are right, we're going to need,
Yeah.
actually, if you want to look for sectors, I mean, we're going to need more people, sounds like, to address this.
Yes, definitely.
Bill, you're a bit on sort of both sides of the trade in the sense of you provide what I would say just as a user is a little bit of a happier place online than maybe the one Christy just described, but equally you're trying to manage a large and dispersed workforce that probably has different expectations of the workplace today than when many of us got in the workplace yesterday.
Certainly. Well, a couple things I'd say to maybe hit both sides of that. You know, there's multiple examples of talking about, well, you know, as we're talking about mental health in the workplace, well, people come to work with all these pressures and, you know, sort of circumstances that they're dealing with outside the workplace that comes to work as well. Caregiving responsibilities, you know, these kinds of things. And so with Pinterest, we've really made, you know, proving a more positive business model for social media central to our reason for being. You know, there's a youth mental health crisis that's happening. I think it's actually broader than just youth. And a big part of that has been fueled by social media and the toxicity that has become central to so much of the business model in social media. So,
is it because they weren't, as young people, prepared for it when they confronted it, or is it just the nature of these platforms in general?
I think that it's multifaceted. I would say that, you know, if I step all the way back from it, you know, rewind the clock, when did social media start to become more toxic? It's when it switched from being a chronological feed of what our friends posted, which if you think back when it was that, most people felt like, oh, it's helping democracies rise up and it's helping us become closer to our neighbors and you know, reconnect with, you know, long lost connections that we hadn't seen since high school or college or whenever. And then one day it flipped. And, you know, I think that flip, a lot of that was about AI being put in charge of what you see in that feed. Instead of it being a chronological feed of what your friends posted, it became a feed of what the AI thought would make you watch the longest. And we talk a lot about AI, you know, these last few years, but it's really a decade plus since AI has been in charge of what you see in those feeds. And the AI figured out pretty quickly that you look longer at the things that are triggering for you, whatever your trigger is. And you know, whether it's, you know, that politician that gets you really fired up, or whether it's somebody else's fake perfect life that you can't possibly live up to. You're looking at somebody else's highlight reel, but comparing your everyday life to someone else's highlight reel. You know, this effect has been in place for, you know, a decade plus and been building. So I think that's really driven a lot of the mental health crisis. And so, you know, one of the things we want to do with Pinterest is we'll prove there's a different business model in that. If sort of engagement via enragement and these kinds of things have become central to the business model of social media in so many ways, can we prove a different business model, one that is centered on positivity and one that can make measurably positive contributions to emotional well-being? And I can talk more about it, but the headline is, we've proven that's possible. We certainly haven't solved it all, but we've proven it's possible. If you could tune the AI to maximize view time, you had all these negative externalities that led to mental health crisis. Can you tune it to be more positive? Can you tune it to make people feel better? And we've proven that's possible. Now there's a lot more of that to do. We've proven that's possible. But the part of that is also, how do we create a really inspired, engaged workforce that's also dealing with these things? And so mental health in the workforce matters a lot to us as well.
So let's come back. We'll come back to the workforce point as you've experienced at Pinterest. But I wonder if some of it is, Christy, talking about AI and how over time that influences the models of what people see, influences political speech, influences everything. Is one thing that you're confronting, well, you come into these workforces that you're describing, try to make a better situation. But is the alternative to that, well, we just won't have those workers at all and we'll try to get the AI to do it? In other words, is there a potential unintended consequence as it relates to those groups?
I think in terms of content moderation, it's not really a little bit. Some companies, I won't say names, but have been really pressured from public pressure because exposure to this is quite, oh my God, that's awful. They've had that exposure and they've said, well, then we just won't do it. And that's not the answer because we need content moderation. The fact that AI could potentially screen out some of the more egregious, and hopefully over time that will happen, but that still doesn't
we should want that to happen.
That's not off the table. And I think even the companies who are largely, BPOs that do all kinds of, like, let's say, customer service work and content moderation, data labeling, they would say, well, eventually this problem will go away because the more egregious stuff will be, taken out by AI. And maybe that's true, but so far that hasn't really happened, despite the promise. And the answer to say, well, we just won't do it because content moderators make mistakes, this could be also, another argument. But guess what? I think the number that's recently been used in the media is 20% mistakes. Well, you could improve upon that if the working conditions were better.
But Minister, is there a trade-off, particularly in communities that you would be familiar with and have talked about? Is there a trade-off between, like, we need the jobs? Some of these jobs are hard and expose people to difficult conditions, but of course, we're not dealing in a perfect world where there's an unlimited number of employment options.
No. I don't understand that very well.
I'm just saying from a government standpoint, yes, we want employment, we want economic opportunity for people. We're finding people go to work, the workplace is a different place than it used to be. It imposes mental health challenges. What are the trade-offs?
Well, at the moment, that's why it will differ from from developing countries to developed ones.
Right.
In a developing country, what you want is a job, regardless of what type of a job. That comes first.
Right.
There's no time of...
It's a bit like your hierarchy of physical health, mental, I want a job. In fact,
unemployment itself can cause serious mental stress, just being unemployed. And in my country, that I can assure you is what's going on. Because just sitting and idling there, especially if you have studied with a belief that you're going to have a better life and you don't have a job, that in itself causes mental health problems. So if any jobs come by, you won't think about the complexities or complications of that job. You'll rush into it. If there's a problem, you'll solve it there at work. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So it might be that in highly developed countries, what they worry about is what type of job, whether it will induce stress and all that. That's not what is happening in low-income countries.
Can I jump in here? Because we represent content moderators in 9 countries, most of which are not in Europe, not in the United States. And the complaints are very loud and clear coming from these countries that this is not a job that I could stay in. That this is, there's no reason, this is not really a big cost item. This is about like a slight rearrangement to work, reorganizing work. This is not something that's going to put the clients that are getting this work done, the big tech companies, it's not harming their bottom line to make this work acceptable. This is a human right to have a health and safety, and I understand that there are different levels, trigger points, depending on how desperately you want the job. But it is still a big complaint, and it doesn't need to be.
Bill, you have, I think it's fair to say, a developed world workforce. What are their expectations?
Yeah, so, a few things I'd say, as we've, really over the last 2.5 years revitalized the company with, emotional well-being, a more positive business model for social media at the core of our reason for being. We've made a lot of progress on that, but a revitalized workforce has been a big part of that. So some of the things that we have done there, when we think about future of work, there's a few things we think about. One, there needs to be flexibility. right? I can come back and talk about what we've done with our PenFlex program that has really created flexible work arrangements that really helps for more people to be able to engage, more of the best and brightest to be able to engage from all different backgrounds, providing the flexibility needed for those who are caregivers, which, by the way, disproportionately you see women and underrepresented groups carry disproportionate amounts of caregiving. And so providing better flexibility has also let us be more attractive to a more diverse workforce, which has actually been part of, we believe, deeply part of our re-accelerations of business and our workforce that's been delivering really great results. So flexibility is one. Second, I would say, is that future-oriented. People want to see career growth and pathways and how there's a future for their job. And I think a lot of discussions around AI talk about, well, jobs are going to go away versus, well, AI can actually create a lot of new ways to do really interesting new things. And so making sure there's a future orientation for career growth. And then thirdly, I would say is just, it needs to be fulfilling. And, fulfilling can happen in lots of different ways, but I think people want to work on something that matters. And there's lots of different ways to find things that people can connect with. But, we saw that as we made positivity central to our reason for being and really connected that with a bigger purpose, that's really, I think, enlivened our workforce even more, that they feel like they're working on something that really matters and doing something that has impact far beyond our walls. But I think, that can be at any organization. So if you can have flexibility, future orientation and fulfillment, these things can really drive real impact. And particularly this one on flexibility, where I think there's a change in direction there, particularly around like forced mandates back to office and things like that. And we're seeing that as we've provided flexibility, one, it's been a great attractor of talent, particularly of diverse talent, but it's also driving collaboration as well. We see that those that take advantage of our PenFlex program are disproportionately engaged in collaborative work, which is completely counter to the narrative that you can't collaborate if you're not in person. But we do have a mixed model. There's some in person, some remote.
Now, Minister Motsoaledi would remind you that in all that developed world context, still nothing competes for many people with just having a job at all. And I think that's your point about the imposed costs of just unemployment on mental health, insecurity in various ways.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. And I think maybe we are agreeing, but just at different levels. Because my argument is unemployment itself is a big, big stressor. And that you'll find more of that in a developing country. Now, once you get that job, it's then that all these problems come in to see whether this is the type of job I want, whether I've got any options, whether I can study. It comes later.
Well, one important factor in that, Steve, do the numbers show, either your numbers that you're talking about today, I would think maybe in both contexts, that women are more at risk to these factors?
Yes, consistently. What's also interesting is we interview men in a lot of these things, and you get differences, particularly things like domestic violence. And of course, the perception of men versus women in so many of these areas is
as to whether
it's not as big of an issue. So you do see consistently on so many of the mental health aspects, women are seeing it as a bigger deal than men. And I think ultimately probably is a head nodder to many people, but it's nice to have the data. I mean, I think the worry index is up to 42% of all women in the world.
And that's
are saying they experience significant periods of worry every day. And the number in the latest one for sadness, and again, the question is written, do you experience this for significant parts of a day, is up to 30% for women.
Christy, who do people in the workforce, whether there's a gender divide or not, who do they think it's their responsibility to solve these problems? Is that companies? Is that
I think it
NGOs?
depends.
Is that governments? Who is it?
I mean, I think if people identify that they have a work-related problem, they expect their employer to help them solve it, or they blame their employer. You know, it could be different sources of anxiety or depression, but you know, at the end of the day, for work-related mental health issues, it is on the employer to figure out some kind of solution. And I think that employers also need to identify that, as I think someone said at the early stages, it's an economic issue for employers. Deloitte did a study that found for every $1 invested in mental health, there's a $5 improvement in attendance and productivity. So I think it's really not just a question of workers have problems and they expect their employers to fix it. It's in the employer's interest to create a work environment that addresses
Well, and you need some measurement, yeah.
Yeah, and I would strongly agree with that. The thing I would add is that I think while an employer has, both a responsibility in some ways, as well as a real benefit if you can address these things, I also think, though, you have to start with the recognition that you don't have all the answers and engage deeply with communities that are affected to find those answers. So some examples that I would give, you have a caregivers group. And so I've talked about some of what we've done around, flexible work arrangements that, are helping those that carry, caregiving burdens or caregiving responsibilities. But we've also, heard through that, ways that we can expand our benefits programs that would be helpful for caregivers. But we've actually done this across as we've driven, greater inclusion in our workforce. We have what we call inclusion groups that, are groups of employees that can come together that, are, share similarities and things that they're facing and can talk about not only what they're facing, but it actually creates forum to talk about, how can we help to solve these things? And that's a forum where sort of folks can come together to talk about, real issues, but also to talk about, well, how can we work together to make progress on those issues? Because we don't have all the answers, and we need to engage deeply with communities that do. Even the work I was mentioning on, our mental health programs, not just for our workforce, but across those that use our platform, we've engaged deeply with those that are in the mental health community, and that's actually led to a lot of some of them here in the room. That has actually led to a lot of the insights that have informed actions that we have taken. So I think, one, you've got to start with acknowledging there is a mental health crisis that's happening. Two, how do you engage? With lots of folks that are trying to solve this and coming with different angles. But then three, how do we think about different effects on different communities and different parts of the population and different answers we might need for different parts of the population, different communities? But I think you have to engage deeply with those communities to get to those answers, because employers don't have all of them, but we can participate in them if we engage more closely with those communities.
Yeah.
I was just going to mention a paradox, and it's a question that I've had kind of looking through the data for us maybe all to think about. But the paradox that I'm finding is, as particularly in more developed markets where we've gone to a lot of remote work, and we're a company that's actually just been flexible. I think we were one of the most flexible companies pre-COVID. We're probably considered less flexible now. We never did any mandates of anything around work in office or anything else. But what I'm finding very interesting, and my children are 23 to 34, so if you think in that group, is so many folks who say they want to work remotely, but I worry are getting incredibly lonely. Mm-hmm. They're feeling like they're connected, and they're saying, yes, and I think the loneliness is feeding into the sadness and worry in a profound way, and I think about it, this is a way too simple analogy.
Drug use and other bad.
Yeah, it's way too simple analogy, but if you ask kids, they want sugar, right? They want candy bars. Okay, well, I want to work from home, but it might not be the best for you, right? Like eating healthy, and so there's, is there somewhere in between that, I'm not saying work in the office all the time, but I think complete remote work, I worry, is actually extending this. We don't have that in the data, but it was a question that kind of jumped into my head.
We've got about 10 minutes, and I want everybody to get a chance to sum up, but I also sense that we've got a little bit of vibration in the room of people who want to put questions to our panel today, and so we should get to some of those, including two in the front row. So you guys decide. Who wants to go first? Great. Thanks. And please just, also for the benefit of the live stream, just identify yourself and however you want to mention your affiliation.
Absolutely. So my name's Alicia London. I'm the CEO at Prospera Global. We exclusively work on mental health strategies for companies, investors, philanthropists. But I'm also a young global leader. So great to see other YGLs in the room. The question I wanted to ask, well, just for some context, I am often approached by CEOs, leadership, with a question of, I just don't know what to do about this. It's a really complex issue. I have to say, Pinterest has been extraordinary and really deeply engaging with communities, and really understanding this. And that's quite rare. So most leadership will come and say, where do I start? There's a list of 100 things. I think even some advocates are, and I come previously from an advocacy world wanting to do the 100 things and will rate you well. So one of the things we've done is created an audit assessment, a diagnostic for companies based in countries and different industries around where the biggest risks and opportunities are to help narrow that down. Do you think that kind of thing is helpful so we can measure it properly and give baselines? Are there other tools that would be helpful? Would be great to hear as leaders what would be helpful for you. And then just one thing I wanted to share, because you brought up my favorite current topic on expectations. One of our assessments, we see this quite a lot, and we just polled US workers in December and found that 50% of employees in the US believed it's a company's responsibility to cause them no stress. No stress. And so actually I think there's a real challenge there for business leaders to not just meet expectations, but not just maybe give the sugar analogy. Is that a challenge? It obviously varies by region. How do we reset healthy psychological contracts between workers and employees in a way that does bring the benefits we're looking for?
All right, two questions there. Who wants to start?
I mean, I can say that we also have an assessment tool that we would recommend to our union shop stewards and so on, or to unions that are coping with problems. And one clear measure is just how many people are absent due to burnout or some other work-related stress, and I think that's an indicator. But there's also some basic factors such as how precarious is the job. And this goes back to your point that not having a job is incredibly stressful. So if you're working in an environment where you're on a 2-month contract, or it's not what you would consider to be a secure job, there's a lot of workplace changes taking place and you're not involved in it, you're not part of the discussion. I mean, we would have an assessment tool. I think that's, and these were the elements that we would be looking at that would normally stress out any worker, and then some would react differently than others. So I think that's a fair point. And as to your point about expectations, which I think is really more closely identified with younger workers, and I also have a 27-year-old and a 30-year-old at home, and I don't know what to say to that, because I do really believe that it's a problem. And this idea that you've grown up thinking work is a place of meaning, and but nobody wants to do work that's horrible. That's a longer conversation. I think everybody's dealing with across generations that I could tell you some of the things that I say to my two, but I wouldn't want to say it in this room.
They might be watching.
They might be watching, and no, I mean, it's just I don't have that much patience for it. But yeah,
let's come here.
So my name is Devyani Pawar. I'm a global shaper from Baramati, India. And I represent the grassroots communities because our hub is the first rural hub from India. My question is a mix of what he said, that unemployment is the biggest concern in terms of mental health. And also I would like to talk about Pinterest as well. So I just want to correlate both of these things. When I talk about grassroots communities, there are so many self-help groups, so many people trying to find opportunities to grow and kind of reinvent the things which they do. So in terms of unemployment and seeking inspirations from Pinterest, how can we bridge the gap between, because Pinterest is perceived as very urban platform, right? But it has such an incredible way of inspiring people to start new things, right? And how can it be implemented in grassroots, because it will solve unemployment issues which happen over there?
Yeah, well, thank you. And that's quite intentional on our part that I talked about not tuning just for maximizing view time and tuning for positivity. Part of what we found that leads to positivity is if you can actually help people to fulfill intent, to go find ways to go take action in the real world to do something. And so I think a lot of these feelings of hopelessness and sadness are much more profound when there's when you feel like it's sort of happening to you and there's nothing that you can do. And so one of the things we see is that as we've looked at the rising rates of anxiety and depression and all these things, and we look at tuning for positivity, well, so much of that is actually helping people engage in something that's going to be a productive outcome for them. And it almost doesn't matter what is that productive outcome. You can choose your own creative endeavor, but finding something that has a productive outcome is actually a great relief of stress. And so part of what we do on our platform is try to help people get from inspiration to actionability, because we see that action, again, whatever it is for you, actually goes from the feeling of hopelessness and things happening to you to, I'm doing something. And even if that something isn't necessarily self-help directly, but I'm just doing something that is worthwhile, that makes me feel good, whether it's figuring out how to put together that outfit that's gonna make me walk a little taller, or how I'm gonna, the meal I'm gonna prepare to bring my family and friends together and what that's gonna mean, or just how I redo the room so it's a better place to get the people I love to gather. These are all just very productive outlets. And so I think that is, so much of our sort of social media content consumption has been around view time maximization. We're looking at how do we create outcomes in the real world so that people are getting real world connection, real world actions, and these things we do see, and there's lots of research on this, these things do lead to more feelings of positivity because it's active and productive versus sort of sitting back and feeling that things are happening to you.
We may have time for one more, if we have one more right by the microphone.
Yes.
Thanks.
My name is Eileen, and I'm from Indonesia. I work in education. I heard that we talk about social media as one of the trigger or of this all mental health problem. But is there a bigger problem in the younger generation, such as mindset? I mean, I heard that someone said that I think you mentioned about employees saying that they expect a work that is not stressful. And I think that will make it even more stressful, in my opinion, okay? So is there a bigger problem than that, which is the mindset? And if so, being in education, I think I want to ask, how do we help this, prepare this younger generation? They will face more challenges in the, ahead, maybe not social media, but whatever. But how do we prepare them so that they're more resilient and not fall into the trap or the pathway of that mental health problem eventually?
Minister, I'm going to put you on the spot because you have a very young population by comparison, certainly with many of the other states represented. And so how do you see that? Are their expectations different than, for instance, when you went off to medical school?
Oh, absolutely. The kids are not like us. Absolutely. And yes, and when you tell them about resilience, they tell you that was during your time.
That was.
Yes, they want everything rolling in on a silver platter, definitely. I mean, I discuss these things with my kids and tell them how, and they tell you that was during your time. Now, your father was poor and doing that to you, and you are rich now, and you can offer me everything I want. So we know the same. And I'm worried. I see a lot of energy drinks used by our kids, almost on a daily basis. It worries me because I don't think they are healthy. So it is definitely a generational problem. I don't have answers on how, because even now, during my time when I was a young doctor, not very young, but at the age of 26, I could work for many hours on end in a rural hospital with no other doctor. It doesn't happen now. You find a hospital with many young doctors, but complaining of overwork and blaming on government, this government is useless and all that. And you can't even tell them. I used to work for 16 hours in a labor ward, non-stop. And I thought it was normal. And I think it developed me. Believe you me, there's no youngster who will tolerate that now.
So, you know,
No way, you know.
Bill, Steve, Christy, Minister, yeah, my day job, I'm a journalist, and I think our headline is "The kids are not like us," right? If I was writing this issue. But thank you all for these insights. Thanks everybody for participating in the conversation. The hashtag is WEF25, and thank you for coming today. Thank you for watching.